Welcome to the 7-step reset. Today we're talking about step 1 and continuing with neuroplasticity. So this is part 2 in a 3-part series on neuroplasticity. It's such an important step, and it makes the point that what we're talking about is very fractal. My view, everything is atoms, so if everything is atoms, you can expect things to be fractals. So while we're talking about neuroplasticity in the context of life, neuroplasticity is also being spoken about today in the context of one stimulus response cycle, and of course multiple ones as well. All right, so quick review where I'm using the 7-step reset to talk about how do we crush anxiety, stop the spiral before it starts. And I'm using the 7-step reset, which I designed for transformation. And that transformation was for my 7 performance areas. But it applies to crushing anxiety because anxiety follows a similar pattern as habit. And when you have control, when you have command over your present moment, and you understand the dynamics and you're managing those dynamics, you're not going to have the anxiety. I literally mean that. And this is not mental health. I'm not talking about mental health. I'm talking about the anxiety that comes because of all the VUCA out there. And I talked about VUCA, volatility, uncertainty, complexity, ambiguity. That so easily leads to BANI, being brittle, anxious, non-linear, and incomprehensible. So BANI is our experience. VUCA is what's happening to us. And we want to be in a position where the VUCA is going to happen and it's going to do what it's going to do, but we're not going to fall into being in the BANI role. We're not going to be brittle. We're not going to be anxious. We're not going to see things as non-linear. We're going to see the value and be okay with things being non-linear. And we're also, it's not going to be incomprehensible because we've already figured it out. And this is similar to the Stockdale paradox. Yes, it's difficult, but I will prevail. And it's having that headspace that you're always knowing that you're going to figure it out. Yes, it's difficult, but I will prevail. Now, the 7 performance areas is where this started. So in the 7 performance areas, these are the 7 areas, and it aligns with most other things you'll see. I've seen the 12, I've seen the 6, I've seen the 5. I used to teach the 6 for many, and I always felt like one was missing, so I wanted to redo it, and I worked through it. And what I ended up with was a be, do, have model. So the mental, physical, spiritual is in our control. This is what we can do, and hold ourselves accountable for this. And then emotional is also in our control, but it can also be hijacked. People get emotionally hijacked all the time. I've seen people make major decisions out of that state of being anxious or emotional, and then they regret it. And so emotional is like the gateway to the right side, relationship, professional, and financial. The big difference between the right side and the left side is that the right side requires other people. It requires involvement. There's interdependency over here, whereas over here it's just by ourselves. So the reason I talk about the 7-step reset in the context of the 7 performance areas is because I run laps like this in my transformation programs. We run laps around these 4 to make sure the person's identity is aligned with their quest. I would say for every quest that you're going after, big quests, this is going to shift. You want the internal game set before you go for the external game. Too many times people start over here because they can do it. It makes sense, and then the next thing you know, they're on their heels. They're getting frustrated. Things aren't working. They're wasting time. They're taking 2 steps forward and a step back. And so we get the identity right, and then this becomes more natural. So that's the idea of mental, physical, spiritual, emotional. And there are outcomes that I want. So every one of these has empowerment catalysts and resistance factors. We want to remove the resistance factors and accentuate the empowerment catalysts. And then the relationship, professional, and financial. I don't speak a lot about that because that's the person's quest. I expect them to be the expert. We helped with the research. I'm a sounding board, but I do recommend, there's 4 books that I really like, and I'm actually adding a 5th. So relationships, if you don't have a plan, if you don't have rules for yourself, I would say Seven Habits of Highly Effective People is a great place to start. Master those 7 habits, and you're going to be able to manage relationships. Professional, I like Good to Great and Great by Choice because the amount of research that went into those 2 books, and also multiplies the amount of research that went into those 2 books. You're not going to replicate that. So I call them near principles. And the other book that I'm considering adding is Primal Leadership because it does a good job of explaining how emotional intelligence fits with leadership and it aligns with dynamic leadership. There is a distinction, I think, while emotional intelligence leads into talking about social intelligence. I think it's important to understand that one of the things that we do in dynamic leadership is obviously we master our own emotional intelligence, but then we read where the person is that we're interacting with because dynamic leadership sits on a continuum between command and control and servant leadership. And it's up to the leader to know when to back off or when to move one direction or the other. And you do that through exercising your emotional intelligence. So that's why the 7-step reset makes so much sense. Because in the 7-step reset, this is our habit, right? Where we are, most people are living 95% of their lives by habit. And when you look into habit, what you start seeing is that we are making about 33,000 decisions a day, over and over and over, making the decisions. But once the day starts, our response primes us, and we're back to the pre-stimulus. We go through this, and the response primes us, and we're back to the pre-stimulus. We go through it, and we're back to the pre-stimulus. So we start priming ourselves. And if you've ever had a bad situation happen, you know how that can like ruin your day. It's just like if you have something really good happen, your day is more positive going through it. So that's just some examples that you can probably relate to. This 33,000 times per day is talking about decisions, but when you pull the cover off of it, and you look at it next to the fact that 95% of our lives are run by habit, you recognize that, okay, if 95% of our lives are done by habit and I'm making 33,000 decisions per day, it stands to reason that 31,500 or so of those decisions are actually stimulus response cycles. And that's how I look at it. And so we have to set the new habits. This is the identity. So we have a new identity because those 33,000 decisions, we want them aligned with our quest, our life design, our purpose. There's more though, because if you look up micro stimulus response cycles, you'll find that there are multiple stimulus response cycles in any given second. Now we're awake about 65,000 seconds a day, so we're seeing a major decision or a decision at the stimulus response cycle level every other second. But if you've got multiple micro stimulus response cycles per second, it's easily we're having 100,000 of these. So you have to start here. You don't have to, but if you don't want to spin your wheels, you have to start where habit resides. And the biggest obstacle to habit change is habit itself, because we're constantly priming ourselves to have more of our tomorrows just like yesterday. And that brings us to the 7-step reset. So you see the pre-stimulus, the conditioned reaction, and the response. And here we're talking today about the pre-stimulus, the taking command of that first step. And this is your self-development. This is, you're reading books, you're going to seminars. This is what you're building up. You're building up your status quo to a point where you can execute all 7 of these steps, or the remaining 6 steps, with finesse and with grace and aligned with your life design. And you start where you are. And like I said, the neuroplasticity applies at the macro level, but neuroplasticity also applies here. And I'll talk a little bit about using neuroplasticity at the micro level here. But the other, so we talked about beliefs, then we have neuroplasticity, then priming. Should be able to talk about that on Friday. And then mindset will be Monday, and then we'll get into physiology. I may spend a day or two on the physiology. And step 2 is like a dashboard. This is where we check in. So we've built the skills here for our status quo. This is our steady state. And then we want to have this step 2 as a quick check-in, because during the day we can get thrown off kilter. We want to make sure that we are above the baseline here. Now, I'm not talking about making weaknesses into strengths, but what we want to do is make sure that our weaknesses are not holding us back. And this check-in, for example, we have skills to get back to a growth mindset in an instant. I'm talking seconds, not minutes. Stopping priming in its tracks. As soon as you recognize that priming, we have tools to reprime yourself. And we start off with priming, but if you get knocked off kilter, you've got to reprime yourself, or you're being primed into a different path that's not aligned with your life design. Physiology. As soon as your physiology starts to drop into something that's not aligned with your quest, you recognize it and you fix it, because a courageous physiology versus a defeated physiology makes a big difference in how you respond to the next stimulus. And, depending on where you are in the day, there's thousands of them that are coming. All right, so that is sort of a review. In this slide, I've updated the slide. If you have an old one, I would say take the picture of this one, because the other slide was sort of a transition. I kind of moving through it. I've updated the slide, so this is the end state. This is where we want to get to. That's how I've stated this at the bottom. I would just take a screenshot and then you have it. So today what we'll do is introduce a new term, and I want to make this real for you. When I'm working with a client, one of the advantages I have, in my opinion, over anybody else who's not doing it this way, is that I see things through the lens of neuroplasticity. And there's a few things that happen in my life that cause that. I would say Ranger training is one of them, going through Ranger school, completing that, and training with Navy SEALs. I've seen what it looks like to be on the other side, where fight or flight doesn't even enter the equation. I've seen what it looks like and feels like to not have anxiety. And then because of placebo and epigenetics, I always knew that there was a way to get there. And neuroplasticity is that lens for me. If you ever read any or watch any of David Goggins' material, he explains this very well also. You can see his protocols are addressing this. Now, that brings up a good point. When I talk about neuroplasticity, if I talk about muscle memory, everyone's with me. They're nodding their head. They can come up with examples when they've used or experienced muscle memory. As soon as I start talking about neuroplasticity applying to actions and thought patterns and what they say and what they did and their emotions, you see sometimes their eyes glass over, or they start trying to make it, oh, that's just like this. Oh, that's just like that. Oh, is that the amygdala? Oh, is that? They're trying to put it to something that they know and understand, because it's not natural to talk about the mind as the network of neurons. It's not that we're talking about the mind as the network of neurons. We're taking back the term mind that was added to the word subconscious. So it's not a mind. The subconscious is not. It's a network of neurons. The conscious mind, 100%. It's a mind. But then you have to look at, well, if we're doing 95% by habit, that means our lives are living in the network of neurons. 5% is by the conscious mind, present moment, etc. That's the 5%. But yet, when you look at people's strategies, they tend to be more knowledge. Recommendations for how to fix a problem out there, get more knowledge. How to fix a problem I'm having, get more knowledge. But if we're only using only 5% is by choice, and some of that is forced choice, it's a non-starter to just keep going down the knowledge path, because to know and not do is basically not, just like not knowing. Now, as you think through this, to keep it making sense, just keep thinking about muscle memory is not muscle memory, it's nervous system memory. And that'll be a start. If you keep reminding yourself that it's nervous system memory, and the neurons that govern my actions are the same, behave the same. They're not the same neurons. They behave the same as the neurons that govern my muscles. When you start thinking about prefrontal cortex, amygdala, basal ganglia, hippocampus, I want you to remind yourself that it's all neurons, and neurons, regardless of where they are in our brain and body, respond essentially the same way. So we don't have to understand where they fit. We just have to understand how neurons behave, because this is more like driving the car. It is like driving the car. It's not like figuring out how to make the car go faster or how to design or build a car. With that in mind, I want you to look at this. Every habit change that we make goes through this. And I mentioned that things are fractal. So in other words, the little is like the big, very similar. And we can look at this as going through your life, transforming in your life, or we can look at this like transforming idiosyncrasy that you want to get rid of. They both go through the same thing. Obviously, one is more difficult. One takes more time, but they go through the same sort of process. So this is our comfort zone. And you could think of that status quo. I'll talk about homeostasis. So the brain and the central nervous system is, when I say wanting to, it's designed to get us back to efficiency. And it makes sense from a hunter-gatherer standpoint. Almost everything I talk about in neuroscience makes more sense when you look at it from a hunter-gatherer standpoint, because that's when the system was built. If you figure hunter-gatherers were around 10,000 years ago, and in fact, many places where you look, it'll say the human brain is 200,000 years old. I've seen 300,000 years old. So neuroscience is in its infancy. But when you look at it, the system, evolution, the evolution was for hunter-gatherer. And it made sense that the system would have to get efficient because they're out there hunting and gathering. And you can imagine if a tribe, let's say a tribe moved around, and when that tribe got to a certain place and they were going to be there a few months, their body would get efficient, right? Acclimating to the weather, building up the tolerance to be able to go up and down hills, being able to hold their breath longer if they had to fish or whatever. So this comfort zone is designed based on your age 0 to 7. Why 0 to 7? 0 to 7, we're highly susceptible to myelination. There's a very low bar for learning because of that. And there's an abundance of neurotransmitter. And there's a low bar for synaptogenesis. So you have plenty of neurotransmitter and you get the myelin. And I'll show you a page from the other day in a moment. Then what happens is this area here, this area in here and this area in here is like your warning areas. This is where you start to get a little concerned. This is where you feel a little anxious and maybe you start pulling back. You do things differently and you get back into your comfort zone, into the fat part of it. When you break through that and you go above, you get into this barrier zone. And this barrier zone is tough because you get this cognitive dissonance that happens. This cognitive dissonance happens because while you were working on going through that line, you can't break through without having a break with the past. Every breakthrough is preceded by confusion, because what's causing this barrier is stories, habits, beliefs, anchors. And anchors can be very broad, but think about the environment, think about what you learn, your organization. Anchors are all over the place. I mean, culture in an organization is just a roll-up of the collective habits. And there's more. Yeah, you can make this list and just keep. But as you've told yourself stories, as you've reinforced habits, as you've uh, lived with your beliefs, you can see how these things come into play as barriers, and in so doing, they're telling you that you can't do this. And that's why sometimes people will end up trying and then they drop back down into their comfort zone and now they're happy. The other thing that happens is here we're operating 95% of our time is by habit. This is exhausting because now you're in 5% of your conscious mind. The brain is a hog for working, and it's like uses 25% of our resting metabolism. And when you consider that our resting metabolism is 80% of the full day, so it takes 80% of our metabolism just to exist, and the brain is taking a quarter of that. Exercising, all this other stuff is only impacting the last 15 or 20%. So you can see how much the brain is demanding just to exist. And so it's happier here because of, and this would be homeostasis. This is that stability. And you have to keep pushing, and it can be rocky. And then sometimes something happens, and a person just breaks through. They lose their job. There's a major catastrophe happens, wildfires, tornadoes, whatever. Their whole life is upended, and they just blow through this very quickly. It's right. It's intensity. It was so much intensity just pushed them through. The point is, on the other side of this, it's different. Now, the picture I'll make is that when we are going through here, if I do a smaller version of this, so this is the goal, right? That's what we want. We want to break through and have this be an inflection point. So everybody's going along, and then we're going to be that one breakout. We're going to be the one who breaks out and maintains that trajectory forever. This takes a lot of energy, takes a lot of work. That's what we're talking about. And the amount of success stories that have in them the person lost everything is just amazing. Because if you look at that, it's like all of the habits, the anchors, the beliefs, they got destroyed. They got destroyed in that event. And so they're starting with a blank slate. You don't have to lose everything to start with a blank slate. You just have to be willing to leave first base and let go of some things. You have to be able to recognize what I call I don't want power, which is triggered when you are using willpower, because the I don't want power is all the things that you've said you're not going to do. And maybe there were things that you didn't like doing 15 years ago, but now they're necessary. There are people who said they never want to sell, and it inhibits their career when it's just a habit that they learned. It's a thought pattern or a habit that they learned as a child, and it means nothing other than they've learned it and now they keep executing on it. So you have to break through. When you feel like there's some resistance, if you can't find any good references for it and it's safe, I would just, question yourself and understand. We talked about that in beliefs. I don't want to go down that path. But so here's what's happening. When we are going through here, if you think about the neurons, the neural pathways, they're all pushing down. They're like, no, we can't do this. Homeostasis is pushing us down. It's the fear. It's pushing us down. You can't do this. This is dangerous. All of the signals are that you should stop. This is dangerous. Don't do it. Now, those are there to keep you alive. So it's not like just some passing feeling or thought. These are intense. And when you push through there, that's why you get the cognitive dissonance. When you push through there, you're literally pushing against your beliefs And when you do that, your fight or flight kicks in, hence the anxiety, because you want to, your system wants to survive. Here's what's interesting though. Let's talk about homeostasis. Homeostasis is the brain predicting what's coming. So the brain predicts how much load there's going to be. And it provides enough neurotransmitter to meet that moment. And it's constantly a loop. It's a feedback loop, and it's constantly looking at how much demand is going to be there and how much neurotransmitter do we need. When the brain guesses right, or when the prediction is right, it starts paring back on the neurotransmitter because it takes a lot of energy to create neurotransmitter. Because the system doesn't need it for this amount of demand. This is where you get plateaus when you work out. You get these plateaus, and that's why if in the fitness industry they'll tell you just switch it up. You have to switch your routines, go something different. Do lighter weight with more reps, and then you flip it back. One of the best routines I've seen is just 3 sets of 15, and then the next day you do 4 sets of 10, and the next day you do 5 sets of 5, and then you repeat 3 sets of 15, and then you take 3 days off. So you go 4 days, and it's a kind of awkward one to do because your days are always changing. But what you're doing is you're constantly guessing. You're keeping the body from going into homeostasis. You skip the plateaus. Gives you an example. But remember, it's not muscle memory, it's nervous system memory. Now, once you get the fact that we're having these plateaus because the system is creating this efficiency, then the next level is to understand allostasis. So allostasis is what happens when the brain is predicting how much demand is coming and it guesses wrong on the low side and there's more demand. Remember how the system is set up. It's for survival. So if the prediction is that the hills I have to climb are a 10% grade, but then you're climbing 15% grade hills, the brain says urgency, emergency, more neurotransmitter. Neurotransmitters are the friend of transformation because you need neurotransmitters for neuroplasticity to happen. If you keep giving it new things, so the next day you're doing a 20% grade, and then the next day a 25% grade, you'll see that every day the system is creating more neurotransmitter. Now, when you get, it doesn't equal, so I don't want to say that, but the same factors that benefit when there's more neurotransmitter improve mitochondria, which are like the organs within inside the cells, and basically we're cells. So if you improve the organs in the cells, you're improving your life, right? So testosterone for men, estrogen for women after menopause, it reduces inflammation. Again, this is the thing, the same factors that happen, that occur with increased neurotransmitter, it correlates to these things. Brain-derived neurotropic factor, which is the improvement of your neurons, so better neurons, more access to neuroplasticity. And I already mentioned anti-inflammation. Because you're moving around the lymphatic fluid, which doesn't have a pump. So there's many, many benefits. The example I would give you, if you ever just do some Google, or if you are on social media, just look up through hikers. And notice what happens with through hikers. So through hikers are people, for example, they'll hike from Mexico to Canada is a common one, the Pacific Crest Trail. There's other ones, the Continental Divide Trail, etc. But when you look at through hikers going for 3,000 miles, 2,000 miles, you'll notice that they start to pick up their hiking miles get longer and longer and longer as the days go on. So if you look at their average mileage, their through hike compared to the first third, it could be double. I mean, they're doing 30 miles a day. Imagine that. A marathon is 26 miles. These people are doing 25 and 30-mile days at the end of a 2 or 3,000 mile hike. That's a great example of allostasis, and I do recommend hiking as something that is a great way to put a continuing demand on yourself. So let me go back to this page, because you'll see this is what I drew yesterday. So this here, these neurons, these are the neurons, and the purple lines suggest that they're wrapped with myelin. That's not how it looks. The neurons don't look like this at all, and myelin doesn't look like this, but it's a way to illustrate it. And then this is the neurotransmitter. When the neurons get wrapped with myelin, which makes them fire faster, stronger, with more accuracy, think about a person who can shoot free throws from shoot 3-pointers from anywhere on the court. That person has built strong neural pathways. There's a lot of wrapping with myelin. If they stop playing basketball for a while, just realized I wasn't showing you the screen. If they stop playing basketball for a while, the synapses comes out, the neurotransmitter leaves that neural pathway. So you're left with the neural pathway, you're left with neurons but no pathway. There's no pathway there, and you can probably experience this. You probably experience this if you do any kind of seasonal sport, or you've gotten away from a sport and you come back the first day out, you feel real awkward, things just don't seem to work. That's because there's no synapse in between the neurons. So even though the neurons have the ability to fire, they're not communicating with each other, and this is why you feel awkward, you stumble, things just don't feel right. But it only takes a day or two, and the neurotransmitter, the brain, the central nervous system moves the neurotransmitter in between those neurons, and now you have a neural pathway again, and you're able to shoot the free throws like you were before. So that's the synaptogenesis. That's what's happening with synaptogenesis. The allostasis is when you keep giving your system more demand than it was expecting, the system keeps creating more neurotransmitter, and that additional neurotransmitter, what it does is it makes it possible to fill in more neural pathways, create new neural pathways, and then when you add deep practice, you start wrapping the neurons with myelin. This is why if you lift weights, you probably have experienced where the best way to get strength gains is to lift with multiple parts. So let's say you want to improve your bench press. A good trainer, a good fitness trainer would also have you doing some maybe rows, heavy, large muscle group exercises, maybe some squats, because they want you to, they may not say it like this, they may not even know this, but that's what works. And the reason it works is because you're flooding the system with neurotransmitter. The same thing with martial arts, the same thing with ranger training. They're constantly increasing the demand across everything. So the body's flooded with neurotransmitter, and neurotransmitter is the friend of transformation. So you have enough neurotransmitter to make new neural pathways and activate new neural pathways. And then down here I have a picture. You have high myelin and high neurotransmitter. This is a strong pathway, and this is your habits that's your strong habit. So if a person has anxiety or catastrophization around a certain thing, it's likely that they've developed this myelin and this strong neurotransmitter around that thing. And that could have happened when they were 3 or 4 years old, but there was so much intensity that the structure's in place, and now it's so easily to access. This is why it's easier to layer on a new habit rather than break an old habit. So back to this example, the brain is trying to be efficient. It's making the assumption that the future is like the past, and it's predicting how much demand you have and creating the right amount of neurotransmitter. When you exceed that, when you break through, so if I have another drawing, when you break through, the arrows flip. And instead of stopping you from going, it's like they flip, and now they're coming up with ideas. This is like that serendipity. Once you make the decision to go for the goal, it depends on how you're wired, right? You may be wired in such a way that when you set a goal, the first thing you feel is resistance, and then you see all the obstacles. That's the reticular activating system, just living into the stories you've always told. Or maybe you're wired that as soon as you set the goal, you start seeing the options and serendipity happens. Either way, if you keep pursuing the goal, you're going to get to the serendipity part, and that's this experience here. It's like the allostasis. More demand is coming. The system puts in more neurotransmitter, and you go from don't do it because it's dangerous to you have to do it to survive, right? Imagine if the a hunter-gatherer and they're going from the flatlands to having to climb hills. There may be resistance in the beginning, but like that thru hiker, eventually their system is going to be throwing neurotransmitter at the problem so that they can climb these hills. People know that dopamine is there it helps with habit formation. What they don't often know is that dopamine is a signal amplifier. So the more neurotransmitter I have, the stronger my signal can be. Now, if you're lifting weights or you're exercising, it makes sense to separate those two things. There's the strength of the muscle and the strength of the signal. And just like I was saying at the beginning of the season, when you feel awkward, the muscle is there. The neurons wrapped with myelin are even there. What's missing is the synapses. When you move the synapses back into, or the neurotransmitter back into the neural pathway, boom, you're golden. And it could happen in the second day. If you go on a 1 week ski trip right at the beginning of the year, you'll feel it. The first day you're so awkward, you're like, man, I should go home. And the second day, bam, you're right there again. And the third day, it's like you never took off. Conversely, and don't ask me how I know this, but if you go out that first day trying to do the stuff that you did on the last day of the season, the prior year, it's not going to end well, probably, because you don't have the neural pathways to handle it, and your muscle memory, nervous system memory is not there. So that's the homeostasis and the allostasis, and why you have to pursue through it. Now, once you're above the line here, it's different, because using the example, I said we had, you're going along, and then you decide you're going to break out, and this is your inflection point, and then you're going, right? It's not a straight line, obviously. It's a lot of ebb and flow. But the difference is down here, habit is supporting it. Up here, you don't have the habits. You don't have the habit.